Hello, my friends. Today we look clearly at what is happening across the geopolitical board, not the filtered version, not the slogans, but the real dynamics of power shaping the world, the forces driving nations toward decisions that will define the coming century. At the center of it all stands the war in Ukraine, a war no longer about territory alone, but about the future balance of power on Earth. Vladimir Putin has issued a direct and unambiguous ultimatum. Either Ukraine withdraws from the Donbass or Russia will take it by force, and Russia has the means to do so. The Donbass is not simply a region on a map. To Moscow, it is the beating heart of industrial production, metallurgy, logistics, rail energy hubs, and the crucial land connection to Crimea. It is the foundation of Russia's long-term security architecture. That is why this objective is not negotiable and never has been. Whether through diplomacy or military action, Moscow intends to secure it completely. European leaders continue pretending there is still some scenario where Ukraine triumphs, but the battlefield tells the truth. Ukraine is losing. Every week, the front collapses further. Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Kupiansk, strategic towns falling like dominoes. The Ukrainian military is exhausted, short of ammunition, short of men, short of hope. Western aid arrives too little and too late. Russia adapts, expands production, floods the field with artillery, drones, precision strikes, grinding down whatever remains of Ukraine's fighting capability. And now winter arrives, a merciless force of nature that punishes the weak. As temperatures drop, Ukraine's broken energy grid fails again. Blackouts return. Elderly freeze in dark apartments. Families burn furniture to survive cold nights. Hospitals delay surgeries. Water stops running. Every month Kyiv waits. It loses more territory, infrastructure, lives, time, options. And most devastating of all, it loses people. The demographic collapse of Ukraine is a slow motion extinction. From 42 million citizens to under 36 million today, possibly below 25 million in just one generation. That is not a country, that is a nation bleeding to death. Births have plunged. Deaths have surged. Millions have fled permanently. Hundreds of thousands of young adults, the very people needed to rebuild, are gone forever, casualties of battle or immigration. Schools close. Clinics close. Villages empty out. The labor shortage is catastrophic. At least 5 million workers are already missing. You cannot rebuild what no longer exists. Russia has so far limited escalation because it still views Ukrainians as a brother people. But Putin has now drawn a bright red line. If Europe wants a direct confrontation, the scale would be utterly different. No more special military operation. Against Europe, Russia would use overwhelming power immediately. No prolonged proxy war, no slow attrition. Europe's cities, command centers, ports all become targets. There would be nothing left to negotiate with. Despite this, the EU pushes decisions bordering on madness, the most dangerous. The attempt to seize Russia's frozen sovereign assets, not just freeze, but confiscate, transfer ownership, and use them to fuel more war. Under international law, freezing is a temporary measure. Confiscation is state theft. If Europe crosses that line, Russia has every legal ground to label it casus belli, a justification for war. And even if war did not erupt instantly, Europe would destroy the very foundation of its financial credibility. What investor would trust a currency willing to steal a nuclear superpower's reserves when politically convenient? Belgium already screams warnings because it knows its banks could be sued into bankruptcy overnight. Even the European Central Bank is alarmed, refusing to support this reckless fantasy. Yet these same European elites posture as enlightened guardians of democracy while corruption spreads through Brussels like mold in a damp basement. High-ranking officials implicated in foreign bribes, shady influence networks, personal enrichment schemes, while at the same time lecturing others about morality. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Why do they push so obsessively for escalation? Because they are afraid, terrified of their own people. Their economies stagnate. Inflation ravages households. Immigration tensions boil. National debts explode. Entire welfare systems crack under pressure. A foreign war becomes their political shield, a distraction from their domestic failures. Meanwhile, Washington plays its own complex game. Donald Trump wants the war ended fast, not because he is pro-Russia, but because he is pro-stability, pro-deal, pro-America first. He sees that endless war brings only endless bills. But ironically, even peace profits the United States. Europe buys American weapons no matter what. What matters strategically is that Europe remains dependent militarily and technologically. Without U.S. satellites, without U.S. intelligence, without U.S. logistics, Ukraine becomes blind and defenseless within hours. This dependency is the core of American leverage. Europe knows it, Russia knows it, Trump knows it, and deep down, every European citizen who pays attention knows it too. Beyond Europe, fault lines shift globally. In Venezuela, Trump signals willingness for direct intervention under the banner of anti-narcotics operations. But beneath the rhetoric lies the real contest. Who controls the resources of the Western Hemisphere, Washington or Beijing? China has poured billions into Latin America while America slept. Now, Washington wakes and wants its backyard back. Maduro mocks the threat publicly, but U.S. destroyers off Venezuela's coast are not a joke. A similar silent struggle unfolds in the Middle East. Israel, backed by the U.S., strikes Hezbollah facilities in Lebanon, sending a message to Iran. And in Asia, China prepares patiently for the inevitable question of Taiwan, watching how the West bleeds in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia and India build something profound, a strategic partnership outside Western control, energy pipelines, long-term contracts, joint technologies, and most symbolically, trade conducted in national currencies. Over 90% now bypasses the U.S. dollar. BRICS rises, slowly, but with purpose. Russia and India refuse to be ruled by a system built exclusively in Washington's interest. And unlike Europe, they learn from history they will not rush into a shared currency like the euro, which trapped weaker nations and nearly collapsed under debt. Back in America, the wounds of January 6th remain open. Nearly 5 years later, investigations and arrests continue, proof that the United States is a nation still at war with itself. Political factions fight harder against each other than against any foreign threat. Internal trust collapses. Institutions lose legitimacy. A superpower divided cannot lead a united world. Economically, global markets tremble. Bitcoin surges, collapses, then surges again, reflecting a system addicted to speculation rather than production. Ordinary Americans turn to discount stores just to stay afloat. Europeans face energy bills they can barely afford. Manufacturing shrinks. Supply chains strain. The world economy stands on unstable ground and the tremors grow stronger. All of this leads to a single defining question. Who shapes the post-American world? Russia asserts it will protect its people, its language, and its influence permanently. China demands a multipolar order, one without Western dominance. India rises as a civilizational power, independent, confident, unaligned. The United States struggles to hold its position, powerful yet vulnerable. And Europe? Europe wanders aimlessly, torn between fear and pride, desperation and delusion. It must decide. March further into a catastrophic confrontation it cannot win or awaken to reality. Choose diplomacy and preserve what remains of its future. Because the unavoidable truth is now blinding. Ukraine cannot win militarily. Europe cannot sustain this war without destroying itself. The rest of the world will not indefinitely support Washington's demands. Russia will secure the Donbass through peace, if allowed. through force if required. The global balance is shifting fast. History does not wait for leaders who cling to fantasy. Those who continue pretending will not shape the future. They will be crushed by it. The age of illusion is ending. The age of consequences has begun. But here is what the Western public is never told. The clock has already run out. Ukraine is not preparing for a counteroffensive. It is preparing for collapse. Its commanders secretly admit that defensive lines are thinning, ammunition rationed, units merged because too many soldiers are dead or missing. Meanwhile, Russia mobilizes fresh brigades. Factories run 24 hours a day. Drone fleets multiply by the thousands. Moscow is not slowing down. It is accelerating. The Ukrainian state survives only because billions are wired into Kyiv every month, money Europe does not have and America is tired of providing. Without constant transfusions of cash, the government cannot even pay salaries or basic utilities. And in Western capitals, political patience is evaporating. Elections loom. Leaders fear angry voters more than angry Russians. The longer this continues, the more obvious the failure becomes, a failure not only of strategy, but of ideology. Because this was never just a war against Russia. It was an attempt to force a unipolar world onto a planet that no longer believes in it. Russia defied Washington, and instead of collapsing, it has grown stronger economically, militarily, diplomatically. Sanctions intended to destroy Moscow instead destroyed Europe's manufacturing base and energy security. The West tried to isolate Russia, but Russia opened new highways to Asia, Africa, Latin American nations, hungry for independence from Western control. The very policy designed to weaken Russia has turned the West into a global minority, politically, culturally, economically, and that is the core of this crisis. Western elites are not fighting to save Ukraine. They are fighting to save their worldview, their dominance, their illusion of eternal superiority. But illusions do not survive artillery. They do not survive demography. They do not survive reality. And reality is merciless. Reality is tanks, drones, trenches, smoldering cities, families fleeing with suitcases, a generation wiped out. Reality is a new world emerging while the old world clings to power like a drowning man clawing at the water. Europe's leaders shout about democracy, yet ignore their own people demanding peace. They call for freedom while censoring dissent. They claim to defend international law while plotting theft that will ignite a wider war. They warn of Russian aggression while pushing NATO weapons to Russia's borders. They lecture the world about morality while fueling the bloodshed of an entire nation so they don't have to admit they were wrong. And as this hypocrisy grows unbearable, something else grows too: anger. Anger among citizens who pay the price. Anger among soldiers forced into unwinnable battles. Anger in countries tired of being treated as subjects, not partners. That anger is the earthquake building beneath the geopolitical surface. One day soon it will erupt, and when it does, the leaders responsible will act shocked, pretend they never saw it coming. But history will remember they were warned again and again. They chose fantasy over truth. They gambled with millions of lives. They pushed the world to the edge of a conflict it cannot survive, because a war directly between Russia and NATO would not be a regional crisis. It would end civilization as we know it. Missiles would fly. Cities would disappear. The lights of Europe could go out forever in a single night, and all for a cause that was lost long before the first shot was fired. So the question for the West is not how do we beat Russia? The real question is, how do we save ourselves from our own arrogance? The war has already delivered its verdict. The unipolar world is gone. The era of Western dominance is ending, and a new order is rising, shaped not by those who shout the loudest, but by those strong enough, patient enough, and realistic enough to withstand the storms of history. Russia is one of them, and the nations aligning with it know the future belongs to those who face reality, not those who run from it. Now the world watches to see whether Europe and the United States choose wisdom or catastrophe. Time is almost up. The next move decides everything. And here is the truth. The West fears more than anything. Russia has already won. Not in some distant future, not after another year of fighting, but right now in the present moment. The strategic outcome is sealed, and every leader in Washington, Brussels, London, Berlin, and Paris knows it deep in their bones. They hide behind speeches, behind propaganda, behind empty promises, but they cannot hide from the battlefield, they cannot hide from arithmetic, and they cannot hide from history. Ukraine has become the graveyard of Western delusion. Tanks destroyed, air defenses overwhelmed, foreign mercenaries fleeing, billions of dollars vanished in smoke. The mighty NATO war machine, the alliance that boasted it could defeat anyone, has been brought to its knees by a nation the West spent decades mocking and underestimating. Russia did not just defeat a military, it shattered an illusion. It exposed that the Western empire of influence is a giant built on sand, a system held together not by strength, but by fear. The fear of questioning power, the fear of acknowledging decline, the fear of admitting the world has changed. The West demanded that Russia kneel, and now it is the West that trembles. They told themselves that sanctions would crush Russia. Instead, Russia became richer, more self-reliant, more united. They believed the ruble would collapse. Instead, the euro and the pound struggled to survive. They promised global isolation. Instead, Russia stood before the world with new allies, new markets, new power. The lie has rotted from the inside, and now the rot is visible to everyone. Europe's factories silent, streets full of protests, governments collapsing, angry crowds demanding answers from leaders who no longer have any. How much longer can they pretend this is victory? How much longer can they burn through the future of an entire continent to maintain a fantasy no one believes anymore? Because while politicians play empire, families freeze in the dark. While elites toast champagne at security conferences, young men are sent to die in trenches for territory they will never see again. And while bureaucrats congratulate themselves on principles and values, mothers bury sons whose only crime was being born in the wrong country at the wrong time. This is not leadership. This is cruelty disguised as righteousness. But the world is awake now. Nations long intimidated by Western power are standing tall for the first time in decades. They have seen that the empire can bleed. They have seen that they do not need permission to be sovereign. They have seen that the future is not dictated from Washington anymore. A multipolar world has already arrived, not with a treaty, not with a declaration, but with the erosion of fear. That is Russia's real victory. Not territory, not resources, but the collapse of the myth that the West controls history. That myth is now dust. The age when a handful of nations impose their will on everyone else is ending in real time. And while Western elites scream louder, stamp their feet harder, their voice matters less every day. The world is not listening anymore. The world has turned the page, and the ones still stuck in the past will soon discover something brutal about history. It does not care about those who refuse to evolve. It crushes them. Just like the fantasy of Western supremacy is being crushed right now under the weight of its own mistakes, arrogance, and denial. The question is no longer whether Russia will prevail. It already has. The only question left is whether the West chooses humility and survival or pride and destruction. That choice arrives now, and the window to choose wisely is closing fast. And so here we stand, at the edge of a moment that will define not only Europe, not only the West, but the future of global power itself. The world is no longer asking whether Russia will prevail. That question has been answered again and again on the battlefield, in the economy, in diplomacy, and in the shifting allegiances of nations tired of being ruled from afar. The real question is whether the West will have the wisdom to change course before it drives itself over a cliff from which there is no return. Because every day that Europe and America double down on this losing strategy, they are trading their prosperity, their security, and their relevance for the ego of politicians incapable of admitting they were wrong. They thought they were scripting history. Instead, history is teaching them a lesson they will never forget. For decades, the West imposed its will on others, convinced that its dominance was permanent, ordained, unquestionable, eternal. But the world has changed while the West clung to an outdated fantasy. Russia is not the collapsing relic they imagined, but a resilient, adaptive, sovereign power that refuses to kneel. China is not a market to be controlled, but a civilization state, building its own path to superpower status. India is not a pawn, but a rising giant, choosing independence over obedience. And country after country, from the Middle East to Africa to Latin America, wakes up each morning with less fear of Western punishment and more confidence in charting its own future. This is the transformation unfolding before our eyes, a multipolar world emerging from the ruins of Western arrogance. Yet instead of evolving, Western leaders retreat into denial. They censor the truth, criminalize dissent, attack their own citizens for daring to question endless war. They claim to defend democracy abroad while suffocating it at home. They shout about human rights while helping turn Ukraine into the largest graveyard in Europe since World War II. But no empire collapses gracefully. The louder they deny their weakness, the more obvious it becomes. The more they blame others for their mistakes, the more isolated they stand. The more they cling to fading power, the faster it slips from their grasp. And while they pretend the world still revolves around them, the planet quietly moves on. Nations form new partnerships rooted in mutual respect instead of coercion. Economies begin decoupling from Western control. Cultures long overshadowed now proudly reclaim their voices. The West can either join this future willingly or be dragged into it by force. That is the choice now. It is not Russia that must change to survive. It is the West. Because Russia has shown that its resolve is unbreakable. It will defend its land, its culture, its security, its people, even if it stands alone, though it no longer does. It has exposed the fatal flaw of Western strategy, the belief that intimidation could substitute for strength. And in exposing that flaw, Russia has rewritten the rules of global power. The West faces a final crossroads. One path leads to adaptation, negotiation, peace, and a place, not the only place, but a respected place in the new world emerging. The other path leads to escalation, catastrophe, and the destruction of the very civilization Western leaders claim to protect. Pride or peace, delusion or survival, a world shared or a world burned. History is watching this decision, and unlike politicians, history never forgets. History will remember which leaders chose honesty over ego, reality over fantasy, and human life over reckless ambition. And it will remember which ones refused to see the truth, even when it stood right in front of them, unstoppable, undeniable, and inevitable. The era of Western domination is ending. The age of sovereign nations is rising. The future belongs to those with the courage to face truth, not to those who drown in their own lies. The page is turning. The world has moved on. And those who refuse to step into the future will be crushed by it.